Hey everybody, it's Charlie at Charlie Slybox, and our latest edition of Ask Charlie has been one that's been asked a bunch by a lot of people, is to sort of explain resins and glues and head cements and the differences between them, and how to go about using them. So that's actually a pretty valid question. There's a lot of stuff on the market these days, and when I was a kid, there was head cement. That was the only thing you had. Later epoxy came into it, two-part epoxy, and that was a really cool material, great material, but very time-consuming and sort of hard to work with and hard to manage in a short period of time. And resin has sort of changed all that. And I'm sure you've seen 8 million videos of people using resin. Honestly, I think it's a little overused these days, but I'm going to just start at the beginning. We'll talk about head cement and kind of work through different superglues and resins and the different viscosities and where they would all apply and where you'd use them. So to start with, regular standard head cement. This is gloss coat from Wapsi, and this is what I've used since I was a kid as far as head cement goes. And head cement is solvent based, so it will eat through the wax on the thread and penetrate all the way through your thread wraps down to the hook. So it's going to make the fly much more secure. That is something that you'll use for durability. Gloss coat does dry to a shiny, glossy coat. And if you put a couple of coats on it, back in the day, that's how you made a shiny head, is you'd have to put maybe multiple coats on a fly to make a shiny head on a streamer. You can do that with gloss coat, but these days resin has sort of taken the place of that. Head cement, though, what it does differently than resin is head cement will penetrate. So ideally, if you're going to build a fly with a glossy head, you should put head cement on first and let it soak down through the thread to the core of the fly, and let that dry, and then come back and put your glossy resin coat over the top. The reason I use gloss coat still to this day, and I use it a lot, is this is the first head cement I used, like I said, when I was a kid, and I just like the way it smells. There's lots of other stuff out there. Honestly, they're all pretty similar, very similar formulas. As you buy it, you can buy gloss coat in a glass bottle like this. You can buy it in an applicator bottle like this. I like the applicator. It's easy to apply. It doesn't spill when you knock it over, which happens all the time, and it makes it really easy to add thinner. So when you first buy this stuff, it's pretty thin. It works pretty well. As it sits on your desk for a while, it'll start to thicken up, and if you don't tie very often, it'll thicken up to the point where you can't use it anymore. But if it's just a little thick and you need to thin it down, there's a very easy way to thin it. And Wapsi now sells, they used to sell thinner for every different kind of head cement. Now they've got some stuff called Thin-All that is an all-purpose thinner. And the easiest way to thin head cement in an applicator bottle is I'm going to take the bottle and I'll squeeze the air out of it. Actually, let me take the lid off this thinner first. I'll squeeze the air out and just turn the bottle over and stick the tube in the thinner and let it suck up some thinner. Then I'll just give it a shake. Pretty easy, no mess application. If you are not lucky enough to have an applicator bottle, there's two methods. One, you could just go to charlieslybox.com and buy yourself one. That's the first option. Or if you're working from a regular bottle of head cement and you want to thin it down, the easiest thing to do there is use a drinking straw and just tuck it down in the thinner, put your finger over the end, and drop some into your bottle, and then shake it up. And you can sort of endlessly thin this stuff. I've had bottles that none of them last very long, but I'll say for a year, that I've thinned repeatedly over and over, as they thicken up. And I like it. I like head cement to be a little runny, a little watery, so pretty thin. And it's still something that I use, on most flies on my desk. I don't kind of famously don't use head cement on little flies, but on anything that has got hair wings or binding down a lot of thread work, I'll use head cement in those places. Just kind of old habits die hard. But head cement is still something that you should have, and it honestly does make your fly more durable than just resin by itself, because it does penetrate down into the thread. So there's fly head cement, there's gloss coat. Like I say, there's lots of different kinds of that, and really they all work about the same. There's also flexible cement or vinyl cement that if you're going to coat a feather, say for a Kaufman stone or Dave's hopper, where you're going to coat a feather and you want to keep it from separating, a turkey quill, that's where Flex Seal or Flex Coat would come in handy on something like that. And still, those come in applicator bottles as well, and I like to use them from that. somebody's going to ask me about Hardest Hull or Sally Hansen's. You know, there's always somebody, excuse me, piping up about. I've used Sally Hansen's for years. Hardest Hull is Sally Hansen's. It's made by Prestige Cosmetics. It's the same stuff. Hardest Hull is clear nail polish. Pretty gooey, dries pretty shiny. Doesn't penetrate as well in the standard issue stuff, but does make a nice shiny head. Really stinks though. If you're sensitive to any of that kind of stuff, this stuff does smell a lot. They also make Hardest Hull Penetrator, which is a much thinner formula that will sink in a little bit more. For bigger flies, these have a paintbrush, like a nail polish style paintbrush, so it's a fairly big brush, and we'll talk about ways to get around that here as we kind of move through this. But that big brush gives you a pretty heavy application. I like to trim those brushes down. Best applied with a bodkin, honestly, and you can just it does dry pretty quick. That's an advantage there. A lot of old-time saltwater guys use this religiously all over their fly. And like I said, it does smell. I find that it even smells when the fly is dry. It still smells for a while. So I don't use that as much as I used to, but that was around for a long time and still something that's really popular. So by all means, if you're used to using it, keep using it. Don't let me tell you what to do. Let's see, what else? So the next thing that I get asked about all the time is super glues. And there's any variety of cyanoacrylate glues. Probably the most popular of which is Zap-A-Gap, and this is Zap-A-Gap with a brush. And this is the most widely used super glue in fly tying, and very handy. I've used it for years and years and years. I've used tons of it. One of the best things about it is this screw top with this little brush that's on the inside. And like I say, that little brush is still too big. What I typically like to do with a brand new bottle of Zap-A-Gap is I will take this brush and I'll wipe it off with a paper towel. I've got a napkin here, right, brand new out of the box. And then I'll come in with a pair of scissors, and typically I'll use an old pair of scissors. I think these are Max's scissors, so I don't really care. But I'm going to cut about 80% of the bristles off of that brush and just thin that down, and then I'll cut it about half to two-thirds its length and kind of to a point. And so now when I dip this in, it doesn't pick up so much glue, and I've got a much finer applicator to put that right where I want it. Now where super glue comes in the handiest is on the internal workings of a fly. So if you're gluing down an underbody or putting a drop at the base of a hair wing kind of thing, super glue really, it is a glue. Head cement, I didn't mention, is not a glue. It's not an adhesive, it's a finish. So it will, while it will soak through the thread, it's not really gluing things down in the true form that Zap-A-Gap or any sort of super glue would do. So I like to use this on the inside of flies or gluing lead eyes down, things where you're trying to add strength. I do not use any kind of super glue for head cement. I get asked that a lot. One of the catches with most super glues is when they get wet, they will turn white. And it may not be the first time, but the second time you get that kind of white chalky residue that comes off of them. It still stays very strong, but you've now got white where you used to have black thread. So I don't use super glue as head cement, but I do use it on the internals of a fly. On a copper john like this in my vise, typically I'd put the lead in, build my thread base, and then I'd put down a layer of super glue just to lock that all down. Particularly if you're stage tying baby gongas where you're doing an articulation, I'll put a coat of super glue down the base for the lead eyes and the articulation where the spider wire is wrapped, and that'll anchor things down there as well. Obviously, one of the downsides of super glue is if you touch it while you're tying, you're going to end up with it all over your fingers. Even with that napkin, I can feel immediately that I've got some on my thumb, and that just irritates the hell out of me. So that's a downside of super glue, but really not many things you can sub for a true glue like this. And there's a lot of different kinds. Loctite makes a couple different versions, a thick and a thin. This has a great applicator bottle that you squeeze from the sides, and it just kind of squeezes out a drop at a time. This is great stuff. I use that a lot as well. The biggest difference, I guess, between so many of these is the application. There's a lot of commercial grade super glues that work great. Starbond is a great super glue. It comes in a big bottle. The problem is it's pretty hard to apply from that big bottle for the tiny little amounts you use on a fly. And I use it, and you have to work around it as well, but that is one of the limitations, is just the applicator. There's also superglue gel, and superglue gel is great for a lot of stuff where you're trying to glue something bigger in place. I'll use this A great example is this is on a slump buster where you'd glue the cone in place. This is a fairly thick gel, and it's got a squeezy little applicator tip that you can squeeze this kind of right into place. It doesn't take much, but you can kind of tuck that in behind the cone on a slump buster, for instance, and then push that back onto the front of the fly and let it lock itself in. A big point on all super glues is a little goes a long way. You need very little of it. It's really easy to overdo. That's a big thing. So anytime you're gluing foam together, or even eyes on a fly, you want to get as little on there as you can to get the job done. If you've got a drip or a drop hanging on the hook at any point, it's going to end up stuck on you, and in worst case scenario, you're going to end up stuck to the fly. There's also Zap Goo. So Zap Goo is even thicker. This is great for applying eyes, sticking eyes to like a hair bug. Pretty thick, kind of squishy, so you can kind of push things down into it. It's also good for just tacking eyes in place and then maybe putting a resin coat over the top. Back in the day, I used to glue eyes on a lot of flies using Zap Goo and then put epoxy over the top. And these days, you'd use resin instead. But that's where the gels and the goos come into place. Like I say, big thing with super glue is, it's a little messy to work with. So I generally try to stage tie up to the point where I need to glue them, and I'll glue them all and let them dry, so I'm not working, with wet glue anywhere on my desk. It just becomes a pain in the neck after a while. So I think that covers super glue. And that sort of brings us to resin. And this is sort of the material du jour these days, and it's all over the place, and there's a lot of different kinds, and I'm not going to say anything besides that I'm going to talk about Solarez resin. And in my opinion, and my experience, which has been pretty lengthy at this point, this is the best stuff going. If I'm not talking about the favorite brand you like, take that for what you will. There's a reason that I'm not talking about some other stuff that's out there, and I've used all of them. I have a giant shoebox on my desk full of every kind of resin on earth, and I've used all of them, and this is the stuff that I won't even say settled on. I have finally found something that works and does what it's supposed to, and does the job well. Solarez has been around. Wahoo Industries, who makes this stuff, has been around over 30 years. This stuff is not new at all. It's new to us in fly tying, but it's been around for a long time, and it was made to repair surfboards, is what the original use of this stuff was. And now it comes in a variety of different viscosities, different colors, lots of variables to it. But it's really, resin has really sort of changed the fly tying world these days. And you see, watching anybody's Instagram or YouTube video, there's resin on everything these days. And I'll tell you, I don't really ever find a spot where I would use resin on a dry fly, and I'll tell you for a couple of reasons. Resin is heavy, so on a little fine dry fly, even over a quill body, either the thinnest coat in the world, or you could just go like we have for the last 150 years and not put any resin on there. Your fly will hold together just fine, maybe just a light coat of head cement. Most of that will evaporate off and kind of just give you a nice little shellac coating over the top. But resin is not really for dry flies, and I know there's a lot of people out there using it. Just think that through. There you go. That's all I'm going to say about that. Now, on nymphs, it's a different story. So there are a variety of nymphs, and most notably this Copper John that's sitting in front of me. And this was the fly, back in the day, in the last 20 years. I think they've sold over 1 million of these things. But it had a 5-minute epoxy wing case. So it had a piece of thin skin, a piece of Flashabou, and then some 5-minute epoxy mixed and put over the top of that wing case. And it makes this nice little bulbous wing case. And that sort of changed the fly tying world. Everybody wanted to do that. And John is not the first guy to use epoxy. I think Mike Mercer probably was, or at least, widespread use where it became popular. I'm sure there are saltwater guys before that. I'm positive of it. But what epoxy does is magnifies your flash, adds a little bit of weight to the fly, like I say, adds some weight to the fly, so not for use on dry flies. But what resin has done is made that job much, much easier. The old 2-part epoxies, you'd had to mix 2 equal amounts and mix it up, and you had about 3.5 minutes of working time before it started to goo up. With resin, it's so much easier. It's just a single part. You can put a drop right where you want it, and then cook it with your UV lamp. And we'll talk more about those here as well. So what that does is it makes it much more usable in places where you would never use 5-minute epoxy, where you just never go to the trouble to mix up a batch to cover a little hotspot tag, or maybe just do the thread head on a fly. Resin you can do that with very, very streamlined, much more easily than you could do it with 5-minute epoxy. So it's sort of taken over the world, and with good reason. It makes a difference. So it also adds some durability to your flies. One of the things I really like about Solarez resin, it is adhesive rather than cohesive. And I've talked about this in the shop a bunch, and what that means is when I cook this onto a fly, it sticks itself to the material under it rather than to itself. And you can take your next favorite brand and put a little puddle of it on your desk and cook it with your lamp and watch it pop off the desk. When it cures, it'll buckle. That is it sticking to itself. That's cohesive. Adhesive will stick to the fly, so it's going to make it not only a much more durable fly, but it's going to stay in place and not chip off so easily. That's my big selling point, or my favorite point about the Solarez. Now this stuff comes in a ton of different configurations, and I'll just kind of start at the beginning here. So this is Solarez Bone Dry, and this is water thin, very, very thin UV resin, and it's not a head cement substitute. You can absolutely put a little drop of it on the head of your fly. It's not going to hurt it, but it's not going to sink down nearly as far into your thread wraps as regular head cement, regular solvent-based head cement would. Now, one of the things that people run into a lot with this, especially out here in Colorado, is if this bottle gets cold, it'll start to crystallize, and you'll get a brand new bottle, and maybe a week later you go to open it up, and the brush is stiff, and it's not liquid in there anymore. The way you fix that is you can take the lid off and just put the bottle in the microwave for 15-20 seconds. The lid does have a tiny little bit of metal in there where it holds the brush in place, and to be perfectly honest with you, I've microwaved the lid and everything several times, but I usually just take the lid and set it like that, microwave it for 15 seconds, and it goes right back to liquid, so that'll solve that problem. Where this stuff is good is for flies like perdigons or thread-bodied flies, where you're just trying to add a little shine to them. It does make a more durable coat, a little thicker coat than regular head cement, but usually a thin application. So great on a fly where you're going to coat all the way around the body, where you're not really trying to build anything up. And that's one thing that I see resin sort of overused, is you don't want to make your fly fatter. Don't tie a little tiny size 20 midge and then put a coat of resin over the top of it. Makes it 3 times as fat as it was to begin with. The hook was thick enough to start with. So I'm not trying to add diameter, maybe just trying to add shine, and that's where something like Bone Dry would work wonderfully. This does come with this little tiny brush, which makes the application really easy, and they actually have a usable brush. As I've wiped this off and used it over the years, I see that they've cut a lot of the bristles out of there. It's a nice tapered brush, so it works very nicely even on small flies. You can also do the kind of wet whip technique with this, and whip finish your fly, leave your thread hanging, and just put some resin on your thread, and then make a few turns and use the thread to apply the resin. That works out really nicely on small flies, or flies where you've got a lot of material at the head that you don't want the resin to bleed into. So that's an easy little move of just a few turns with some wetted thread with the resin. So that's where I'd use Bone Dry. Now, one thing I should mention, Bone Dry, some people are very allergic to this. I don't know what the predisposition is, but if you get hives while you're using this, that it's not terribly a surprise. That I won't say it's super common, but it's common enough that we all know about it. So it does have an odor, and as you cook it, it lets off some gas, and is apparently pretty allergy causing for a lot of people. So be aware of that. If you use this and start to get hives or get your face puffed up a little bit, that's probably what it's from. Which is why they have come out with Bone Dry Plus. So Bone Dry Plus comes in a little bit different applicator bottle. This has got a squeezy little tip on it, and it's just ever so slightly thicker than Bone Dry. Honestly, I don't have any allergies to this stuff, but I do like Bone Dry Plus better. It's just slightly thicker. It's a little easier to manage, doesn't run, doesn't bleed into other materials quite so easily, and it doesn't smell or cause allergies as badly. I won't say at all, but not nearly as badly as regular Bone Dry has historically. This is sort of the thin resin that I use of choice in most spots on my desk. This is a nice thin material, and you can really apply it straight from the bottle. With this little thin applicator, you can get just a tiny little drop of it to come out and kind of place that right where you want it. Now, this is not something that you would use to build a wing case on a copper john or coat the back of a jujubatus. This stuff is still fairly thin. You'd have to do several coats to get it to build up, but the liability as you move from thin to thick, the thinnest stuff is going to want to run. So it'll run and bleed down into materials, maybe run all the way around the fly. In the case of a wing case or a jujubatus, I'd move towards something a little bit thicker. But if you're coating a fly all the way around, just like regular bone dry plus, kind of same applications, fairly thin stuff. So if you're coating all the way around the fly body and you don't have a lot of other materials on there for it to bleed into, or you haven't put them on yet, that's a great spot to use. Perdigons are a great example of where a resin like bone dry or bone dry plus would work wonderfully. You can also tie those flies, with a thin formula. Let's see, thin. That's medium thin. Is a thin formula. So this is a 2-ounce bottle. If you tie a ton, it'll take you forever to use this bottle up. But the thin formula Solarez is pretty widely used. Pretty versatile. Honestly, you could, if you had a bottle of bone dry or bone dry plus and a bottle of thin, you can probably get away with a lot. Maybe I might lean toward medium if I was only going to have two, bone dry and medium. But the thin is pretty thin stuff, and you can always build up extra coats of it. And I'll put some on a fly here and kind of show you how to go about doing that as well. But the thin is best used on applications, smaller flies where you don't have as much bulk and as much volume of it. If you put a big gob of this on a streamer head, it's going to want to run and be a little hard to control. So smaller size flies or thinner coats. It's still going to build up more than bone dry or bone dry plus, but you can just kind of extrapolate as it gets thicker. It's going to run less. Be a little easier to position and stay in position a little bit better in the meantime. So that's the thin. Medium is probably what I use the most. That's what's on my desk that I use the most in a thicker application. And this is what I'd use for the wing case on a copper john or a jujubatus or a 2-bit hooker or any variety of my flies. This is just a nice viscosity, kind of all-around use. It's thick enough to use on big stuff, and it's thin enough to kind of string out on small flies. My favorite way to do it is, especially out of a big bottle, is I'll put just a little drop of it on my tabletop and just work with a bodkin to apply that onto the fly. And as long as you don't get any sunlight or UV light on that, it'll stay liquid for your working time. It is funny, even overhead lights will have some UV factor to them, so that can cook your resin if you leave it on your desk overnight. So I just leave that drop there while I'm working, and when I'm done, I'll take my UV lamp and cook that also, and then I can kind of peel that up off of my desk. You could also do it on a sticky note if you were doing that on your kitchen table, so you don't get in trouble. So that's thin. Then there's thick. So thick, where you need it, you really need it, and where I find this most useful, the thickest stuff, is if I'm going to build a fly like a deceiver. Here's a great example. Where I'm going to be coating over eyes or around eyes to build a bigger head or shape a head. The thick I can apply in between the eyes on the top and the bottom and sort of drag it with my needle into position, and it doesn't want to run. It doesn't bleed back into the materials. It doesn't sag down underneath the fly. That thicker material is just easier to kind of hold in place in a heavier application. So that's where I would use the thick. If you get into flies that have eyes glued on the outside, a swim coach for instance, this is a great spot. I actually use 2 different kinds of resin to do this. I typically will take and tack the eyes in place with bone dry plus, and then I'll take the fly and put him either in my fingers or my vise vertically, and I'll use a flexible resin. So this is Solarez Flex. So this has got a little, it won't dry hard, it's not crispy, it's got a little bit of flex to it. And the advantage here is on a streamer or a fly that you're kind of smashing into the bank every now and again. It never happens to me because I cast super accurately all the time, but Max, for instance, breaks the eyes off his flies all the time, so this is really helpful for him. A flexible coat over the top of that is going to give that a little flex so those eyes won't chip off so easily. That's been a big epiphany for me over the last few years, that flexible coating on the head over eyes makes a big difference in keeping those eyes in place. So that brings us to some colored Solarez, and this is bone dry, so basically bone dry plus formula. It's about the same thickness, but it comes in a ton of colors. And there's a lot of Perdigon patterns these days where you'll put, I've got one here, and I did tie this. I took it out of my actual fly box, so this is a real-world empirical knowledge thing, but it's got a little hot spot on it, and that's just made with a little spot of brightly colored solar res. And it comes in a bunch of colors. There's, gosh, I don't know, there's 20 colors, I think. Very easy to add just a little spot on there and cook it over the top. For instance, on this slide, this has got Bone Dry Plus over a wire and thread body, and then just a little orange hot spot that I made with UV resin in colors. So it comes in a variety of colors. Really handy, the colored stuff, for making eyeballs. If you're making eyeballs for shrimps or crabs, even damselfly nymphs. It comes in black as well. I should mention Bone Dry. The original Bone Dry comes in black also. If you want to make a nice glossy head on a streamer like a black ghost or something like that, classic streamer, makes that job really easy. But it comes in colors as well, so a lot of versatility there. Now, as we sort of talk about how you apply this stuff, what I like to use is a short needled bodkin. And the reason I like the short needle is when you go to apply, I'm not even sure if I've got a long needle bodkin around the shop anymore because I hate them. A long needle bodkin would be the equivalent of holding the eraser end of the pencil and trying to write. You think about whenever you're trying to do fine work, you've always got your fingers up close to the tip. This is a Tiemco short fine bodkin that's got a really sharp metal tip. And I can work from my puddle of resin on my desktop and pick up a drop and apply it with the very tip of that very accurately, because I'm holding it much closer to the tip of the needle. The kind of old school bodkins with a long needle and a short handle are pretty cumbersome and not very accurate for that application. So I like to work with one of these. And then when you cook your UV resin, we're just going to imagine that I applied some resin here. You see this all the time, and I'm guilty of it as well. In our videos, you're always holding the light down here close, and that's mostly so that it shows in this short little window that we've got with the camera. Realistically, to cure this well and to cure it right, the last thing you want to do is hold this up close to the fly. What you want to do is you want to hold it 8 or 10 inches back and shine it on the fly, and then rotate the fly as you go. So it's kind of not all going in one spot from a short distance all at once. I like to hold it fairly far back and just rotate the fly, and that will cure it much more slowly and much more securely. If you've got problems with your resin chipping off the fly, you probably cooked it right down there. That cooks it too fast. If you see the little puff of smoke come off the top, you cooked it too fast. So further away, and you can blink it on and off. Just blink the light on and off of the material. That'll make it clear up and dry much more evenly, and it makes a much more secure coating on top of the fly. As we talk about lights, there's a lot of different lights out there. The best light I found is this resonator light. This is from SolarEz, and the thing that makes this the best light that I found anyway is it's got a rechargeable battery. So it's got a big rechargeable battery in it here, like so. And it comes with a charger, so that charger makes a huge difference. One of the things that we've all sort of encountered over the years is if your lamp batteries are low, it just doesn't cure it as well as if they're fully charged. So if you've got a light that you've got to put new regular store-bought batteries in, you've got to replace them fairly often. It's not that your light is not working anymore; it's that your batteries are not at full charge anymore. With a rechargeable battery, and I charge mine about once a week. With a rechargeable battery, you've got full power coming out of the battery at all times. So you can see how strong that beam is. That's going to cook that down nice and good, and just an easy, simple recharger. They're not inexpensive. They're about $57, $55, something like that. Honestly, I've bought every light on the market. So if I'd have bought this one first, I'd have been, I don't know, a couple $100 ahead of where I am now. So nothing's cheap. Nothing good is cheap anyway. But if you do a lot of this stuff, the right lamp makes a huge difference. I think I've covered most of the pieces and parts. I don't know that I've missed anything on my list. Yeah, I think that about covers it. I had a vanilla latte this morning, so I'm sure that was a 27-minute long video that took place in 13 minutes or something like that. We'll see how close I am. But that's my answers for adhesives and glues and resins and head cements. If you've got more questions, put them down below or send them to askcharlie@charliesflybox.com, and we'll try to get to those as soon as we can. Make them good. That's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Take care.